Hello, and thank you for joining me as we discuss zero tolerance, a look at the history, impact, and alternatives to zero tolerance practices. I'll be your host. My name is Steph Jensen. I am the Director of Community Contracts at Boys Town. Boys Town is a nationally recognized organization celebrating 100 years serving children and families. Our mission is to change the way America cares for children, families, and communities by promoting and providing a continuum of care that strengthens mind, body, and spirit. In addition, we have comprehensive interventions and practical strategies that address a wide range of needs in education. These research-proven strategies provide consistency and predictability throughout a multi-tiered approach. One of our primary goals is to empower educators with the tools to address all levels of behavior in the classroom, hallway, and beyond. So let's look closer at zero tolerance and our goals for today. We're going to look at the origin, application, and impact of zero tolerance policies in schools. We'll also look at some alternatives to zero tolerance policies. And we'll review a resource checklist to assess the feasibility at your program to start implementing alternatives to zero tolerance practices. The primary mission of school is to educate students in a safe and nurturing environment, a place where they feel valued and welcome. And to achieve this goal, school systems have adopted discipline policies that outline codes of conduct and behavior expectations. Zero tolerance is one policy commonly included in schools. Zero tolerance policies dictate a very rigid and prescriptive approach for dealing with problem issues. The interesting thing about the application of zero tolerance policies to problem issues is that zero tolerance really wasn't created expressly for dealing with student behavior. Zero tolerance was first applied in the 1980s as a strategy used by U.S. Customs to combat the rise in the drug trade. But over time, zero tolerance practices were applied at state and federal agencies to address a range of things, including social, educational, and even workforce problems. It was in the 1990s when we started to see zero tolerance applied in schools. Zero tolerance policies were widely adopted in 1994 through the Clinton administration's passing of the Gun-Free Schools Act. This was in an effort to address the rise in school violence. This act created zero tolerance policies for students that brought a firearm on campus. And under the Gun-Free Schools Act, schools are required to issue a minimum 1-year expulsion to students, or they would risk losing those federal funds. But by 1995, the language of the law was changed, and that's when we saw a replacement of the term firearm with weapon. And this change in language altered what was a very problem-specific policy and changed it into something that could be broadly applied to multiple different school discipline practices. In the following year of 1996-1997, most schools had zero tolerance policies covering behaviors beyond those that were originally addressed in the Gun-Free Schools Act. They started to include things like drugs, alcohol, and fights to apply those zero tolerance policies. This allowed even greater liberties in interpreting and applying zero tolerance, which have taken such that less severe behaviors are now being addressed using a policy that results in mandatory suspension or expulsions, and in some cases referrals to juvenile courts for offenses that historically would have been addressed by administrators who were allowed to examine each situation individually and use their judgment. By 1999, suspensions were being handed out in some schools under zero tolerance for infractions such as swearing, truancy, insubordination, disrespect, and even dress code violations. This problem of zero tolerance policies that they have been applied to truancy, because in many instances, when kids are truant from school and then they receive a suspension or expulsion, that's exactly what they want. They prefer not to be in school. And what happens then is we see this impacting the surrounding communities in negative ways. The assumption of zero tolerance and suspension policies is that the removal of these disruptive students would also deter other students from engaging in similar behavior, and at the same time enhance the classroom environment. Now, sometimes this is the impact. However, it's imperative that administrators really look at the outcomes of these suspensions in a case-by-case matter in order to assess that the removal from school is actually a deterrent to future negative behavior for the student that was suspended, and also the impact on the peers that observe this suspension. Suspending kids for truancy could inadvertently reinforce that problem behavior, might lead to more students engaging in even more problematic behavior so that they can receive that suspension or expulsion. This is especially the case for our students that are suspended and have very little or no supervision at home. It's dangerous to assume that every student who is suspended is going to benefit from such a consequence and that there is adequate supervision for them. We'll discuss the actual impacts that have been noted in the research on zero tolerance and suspension policies. But for now, let's look a little bit closer at the application of zero tolerance policies, specifically some of those instances that seem to be a bit excessive or where the policy may have been applied inappropriately. We can find many examples of the overuse or abuse of zero tolerance. For one student, a 12-year-old student brought a Swiss Army knife to clean out his fingernails and received a suspension for having a weapon. We have the instance of a 5-year-old who wears a firefighter Halloween costume that has a plastic axe that receives a suspension for a weapon. A 6-year-old student, male student, kisses a female classmate and is suspended. A student brings a plastic knife to cut a piece of chicken in their lunch and is suspended for having a weapon. Possessing things such as Myadol or a water pistol have also led to suspensions under zero tolerance policies. An even broader use, one young lady suspended for having blue hair dye. And then the examples of classification of a snowball and kicking as a deadly weapon. We've seen recent national coverage of stories such as the one of a 7-year-old boy who bit his Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun and received a suspension. A 5-year-old kindergartner suspended for 10 days for bringing a Hello Kitty bubble-blowing gun to school for show and tell. These stories pile up, and the evidence of the misuse of zero tolerance grows, and it bolsters the case that this policy is being used for offenses that many might argue don't warrant such severe punishment. At the very least, it would seem that administrators are being pressured into taking a rigid stance on zero tolerance. And in reality, zero tolerance has had the opposite effect from its initial intentions. The goal was to decrease school dropout, and we actually see an increase. We wanted to see an increase in student academic achievement, and we've seen that zero tolerance practices have a direct impact to actually decrease academic achievement. We wanted to increase people's ability to enter the workforce, and we find that zero tolerance decreases students' readiness to enter the workforce. As we see the increase of the application of zero tolerance to these minor behaviors, we're also seeing an impact on outcomes with our students and safety in our schools and communities. Let's look at 2011-2012 school year. This is a year where we saw 3.5 million students received in-school suspensions. 1.9 million students received an out-of-school suspension, and 130,000 were expelled. And these numbers are not just impacting our middle or high school students. We're seeing a significant impact on the youngest among us. In a recent report released by the Data Resource Center for Child and Adolescent Health, on every school day in 2016, some 250 preschool children across the United States were suspended or expelled for bad behavior. In total, about 50,000 preschoolers, little people ages 3 to 4, were suspended. An additional 17,000 were expelled. Of these preschoolers, African American and Hispanic children were 2.2 times more likely to be expelled, and 82% of those suspended or expelled were boys. Overall, minority students are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled, and boys make up 77% of all public and private school expulsions. In addition to the disproportionality as far as minorities and boys specifically, we also see that students with disabilities are 2 times more likely to be suspended or expelled. And 73% of students overall that are diagnosed with learning disabilities are boys. So we're seeing some commonalities here in our data. Suspension increases. If you receive 1 suspension or expulsion throughout your education career, it increases the likelihood that you will drop out by 77%. Meaning that suspended or expelled students are 5 times more likely to drop out. And this leads to the direct criminalization of our students. This is what really is feeding that school to prison pipeline. And we also see that there's a strong correlation between students that are suspended or out of school, that they have an increased use of drugs, alcohol, and access to weapons. We also see that schools are becoming one of the primary sources for juvenile justices, for referrals into the juvenile justice system. We are criminalizing what in many instances is normal childhood behavior. As we look just at brain development, our kids, they're developing brains, they do not have a perception of risk. They are not looking at the impact of their behaviors. They don't look at cause effect. They're not future oriented. They're not looking at how their behavior today might impact their paths for tomorrow. They have very little impulse control. They're irrational and impulsive. And so zero tolerance policies really are poorly suited to address adolescent development. So what can be done to mitigate the effects of zero tolerance policies and promote a culture of learning? Well, as we look at best practices, it's recommended that you have a multi-tiered system in place. This in turn creates a climate of learning, a climate of calm. And we know that the number one influencer on a school climate or a school culture is the attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs of the adults. It's not the students that create the culture or climate. It is the adults that create or have the greatest influence on developing the culture of a building. So how do we do that? Well, we know that if we have universal practices in place that are applied consistently, we can increase academic achievement by between 18 and 21%. This is some research that was conducted by CASEL, the Collaboration for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. Those universal practices, when implemented, contribute to a climate of consistency, predictability, and safety. So how do we do that? Well, first we have to have common expectations. And with those common expectations, we have to include practices to teach those expectations to our students. When we look at a multi-tiered system, we want to focus on building relationships. We want to increase social emotional competencies, and we want to restructure our discipline practices so that we're moving from punitive to preventive. When students engage in difficult or challenging behaviors, adults tend to fall back on traditional behavior management practices, such as control and compliance and punishment. These methods generally escalate the intensity of the situation and oftentimes leads to the increased use of these consequences like suspension and expulsion. While these methods might stop the behavior in the moment, they do nothing to change the behavior overall. If punishment changed behavior, we wouldn't have any misbehavior in our schools. If punishment changed behavior, we wouldn't have any recidivism in our prison system. But we know that we do, because all that punishment can do is stop a behavior. The only way that we can change behavior is to teach a replacement. So how are we doing that intentionally, and are we doing that consistently in our schools? It seems that we have contrasting approaches to developing this culture of awareness, this culture of calm in our buildings that can really negate the impact of these zero tolerance practices. When we recognize that zero tolerance policies are not achieving the results that they were designed for and are actually having a negative impact on our education system, it's imperative that we make necessary changes to improve the outcomes for the children we serve. It's time to look at alternatives to zero tolerance and change our approach to addressing behavior. When students engage in difficult or challenging behaviors, adults tend to fall back on traditional behavior management methods, such as control, compliance, and punishment. These methods generally escalate the intensity of the situation and leads to increased use of consequences, like suspension and expulsion. While these methods may stop the behavior, it does nothing to change the behavior. So if we want to look at alternatives to these severe consequences, we need to look at the differences between traditional behavior management and a more proactive approach like the Boys Town education model. A traditional view of behavior interventions views the student as the problem, while a more proactive approach focuses on environments, the modeling, and skill deficits with the child. So we want to switch from what is wrong with you to what might have happened to you as we become more proactive in addressing behavior. Traditional behavior management tries to fix the student by just stopping or extinguishing that problem behavior. That stops the behavior for the moment, but it does nothing to change that behavior, provide a replacement behavior. In more proactive approaches, we want to help the child develop the skills that are necessary for them to be successful in social interactions. Traditional behavior management approaches generally rely on rigid and aversive approaches, generally looking at a lot of punishment and consequences, where a more proactive approach looks more at the emphasis on positive reinforcements and shifting from that reliance on aversion to focusing on positive. So really trying to increase reinforcements for kids. With traditional behavior management, the goal is compliance. We want them to stop that behavior immediately because we said so. But that doesn't help them to be lifelong, that doesn't help to develop that lifelong social emotional competence that we want to increase in our students. Traditional behavior management is looking at it as a quick fix. There is no silver bullet, I'm sorry to tell you. There is no quick answer, quick fix for shaping behaviors or changing behaviors. It really is an ongoing process. So who has the most influence in shaping those behaviors? And sometimes I think that as educators, we kind of stand back, and when we see some of these larger behaviors or these more intensive behaviors, we think, oh, we can't do that. We need someone with more experience or more letters behind their name to come and fix this child or come deal with this child, when really what we know from research is that the person that spends the most time with the child is the one that has the most influence in shaping or changing those behaviors. I don't think it matters how great of a school counselor you have, or maybe what a great school counselor you are. You may be, or you may have the best school social worker, the best behavior interventionist. But if the child is spending the majority of their time in a toxic environment, or an environment where someone doesn't know how to address those behaviors proactively, no matter how much good you can do in maybe that 45 minutes that you see that child each week, it's going to be difficult to see any real growth or change without changing the overall culture or impacting the individuals that have the most direct contact or interaction with the child. So if our goal is to increase safety and improve student achievement, best practices recommend that we implement a multi-tiered system of support to address both the academic and behavioral needs of our students. The foundation of a multi-tiered system is universal practices that address academic and social emotional needs of approximately 85% of our student population. So when we look at that universal as a foundation, we're really saying that everyone in the building that comes into contact with kids are going to have the skills to improve or shape not only their academic success, but also their behavioral success. And when we have a solid universal, we know that we're going to meet the needs of the majority of the students in our schools. And we tend to have very structured and developed universal practices for academics. However, oftentimes we have a very underdeveloped or poorly defined system to universally support behavioral and social needs of our students. For example, we generally have a well-defined curriculum with teaching strategies, lesson planning, and curriculum that is consistent from teacher to teacher, from city to city, from state to state. And this generally will address the majority of the academic needs for students. When these universal practices are applied, we meet the academic needs of approximately 85% of the students in our classrooms. And we understand that there will be about 15% of our students that need a little extra support when it comes to academics, and we have strategies to address that. Some students may need a study buddy, or they might need small group instruction, or they may have to have content explained in a different way. And this is what we refer to as Tier 2. And again, generally that's about 15% of our students that need those additional academic supports. And then we know that there's about 5% of our students in the classroom that have significant academic struggles. And they might need modified curriculum, they may need special education supports, they may need someone to read tests to them, we may need to change the allotted amount of time for them to complete an activity. And again, that's generally about 5% of our students. And academically, we know how to meet those needs at multiple tiers, or those differentiated needs of our learners academically. But behaviorally, often, we don't have those supports as clearly defined, and generally they aren't consistent across our campus from teacher to teacher, or from classroom to classroom, or from building to building. Oftentimes we kind of make it up on the fly. We kind of do our own thing. But we know if we have a universal intervention to meet the social emotional needs of our students, we'll be able to address about 85% of the overall behavioral challenges in our building. There will be about 15% of our kiddos behaviorally that need a little extra help. This would be something like small group social skills, or maybe it would be anger management or conflict resolution, or even a positive alternative to suspension, a small group to help intervene in that the behavioral challenges that students might have. And again, about 15% of our kids are going to need these interventions. And then we know that there's going to be 5% of our students that need intensive supports around behavior. These are our kids that might need an alternative placement. They may need some sort of a motivation system, or a token economy, a behavior plan to help them shape more pro-social behaviors, but looking at that specifically as a behavioral intervention, not a place where they just sit and serve their time. We want to be intentionally and proactively teaching those behaviors to help them be successful. If we look at our overall goal, our overall mission as educators, I think that we would agree that our goal is to contribute to the development of healthy contributors to our community. And if that's truly our goal, we have to understand that 78% of people that get fired from their jobs in the United States is not because of a lack of academic skill or academic knowledge. 78% lose their jobs because of a lack of social skills, poor social skills and social interactions. So if we truly want to contribute to that overall healthy contribution to our communities, it is our responsibility to proactively teach those behaviors. We can consistently and intentionally teach to behavior in the same way that we teach academics. And that way we can reduce the use of zero tolerance and create a more safe and predictable environment. While this sounds good in theory, we often struggle with the application. Historically, and even today, we receive very little training in how to manage behavior in the classroom. And without training on how to serve or support the social emotional needs of our students, we tend to rely on traditional methods that are punitive and not conducive to shaping behavior or creating a positive climate for learning. 90% of our teaching training is focused on academics, lesson planning, pedagogy, and curriculum, while only 10% of our training is focused on managing behaviors. I don't think any of us go into education because we hate kids, but I think sometimes we start to hate kids because we're in education. And it's not really the kids that we hate, but the behavior that we don't know what to do with. This is why we lose 50% of our educators from the profession within the first 4 years. And it's not because they all of a sudden hate teaching or hate their curriculum. It's that they don't know how to handle behaviors, and that becomes overwhelming and exhausting. So we really need to start providing training that clearly provides interventions and strategies to develop those universal approaches to addressing behavior in our schools. Boys Town offers a comprehensive system to meet the behavioral needs of all students in a consistent and predictable, proactive way by providing training for all individuals interacting with students. We offer strategies to move from a philosophical approach to a more practical approach. This starts with identifying social skills to teach all students. I believe, as does Dr. Terrence Scott from the University of Kentucky, that if you don't teach the behavior, you have no right to correct it. We have to be intentional in teaching the appropriate social skills to use in school so that all students have the foundation for appropriate school behavior. By front-loading all students with the appropriate social skills in a universal way across the building, we can reduce the use of consequences like zero tolerance. It allows us to have conversations about behavior with kids rather than confrontations. Boys Town has identified 16 social skills to teach in schools for students to be successful. You might want to start by identifying 3 or 4 that everyone will teach intentionally and consistently throughout the building at a universal level. This is where we start to move beyond that philosophical to the practical. Here's a list of the 16 social skills that Boys Town has identified. And I think if you look at these, you will agree that if kids can engage in these behaviors the way that they are task analyzed or written out here, the more successful they'll be in school and outside of school as well. Many districts or schools have adopted some form of positive behavior interventions and support, or multi-tiered system. And many have done a nice job of defining their universal expectations. For example, your school may have universal expectations like respect, responsible, and resourceful. And these sound really good. You might have them posted around your campus, you might have reviewed them with students, and you may even be able to go in the hallway and randomly select 5 students and ask them what the universal expectations are. And they might be able to list them. They may be able to repeat, yes, here at our middle school, we are responsible, respectful, and resourceful. Yay! And we're really excited that they're able to repeat these to us. And so then sometimes I think we get that idea of, okay, that's done. Let's put a check mark by it. We've taught the skills, we've taught behaviors. But in reality, can we define those? Can you define respectful, responsible, or resourceful? Can every teacher define them? And if they define it, is it going to be the same definition for each teacher? The same with students. Can they define what that means? Respect, responsible, resourceful. And if they do, if they are able to provide some sort of definition, is it consistent from student to student, from teacher to teacher? And oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes it's our perception of respect. And what I think is respectful might not be what you think is respectful. The way I define responsible might not be the way that you define responsible. And so then what tends to happen with these universal expectations is we use them negatively, such as you're being disrespectful, you're being irresponsible, yet the student doesn't exactly know what you mean by that. So when we start attaching skills, we get deeper and more defined with our social emotional strategies and interventions. So for example, as you look at this list of 16 social skills, are there 3 or 4 that would meet each of these definitions or could be a part of defining respect, responsible, or resourceful? I think you can. If we look at following instructions, if we can all follow instructions by looking at the person, saying okay, completing the task right away, does that show respect? I think it does. Does that show that you're responsible? Sure. Does that show that you're resourceful? Absolutely. So if we teach following instructions, we start to more clearly define our universal expectations. And we can do that consistently and intentionally, because now all of us adults or teachers in the building can say, in order to be respectful, you need to follow instructions. And here's how you can do that. So following instructions is one. I also think that being able to accept feedback or consequence shows that you're respectful. It also shows you're responsible. It can also show that you're resourceful. Being able to disagree appropriately is an important skill. And if you can disagree appropriately, you show that you're respectful, you're responsible, and you're resourceful. So at a universal level, you can start to see how when we more clearly attach social skills, specific social skills, we are able to address multi-tiered needs of our students, and it also helps us to support one another. Because now we're moving from the individual to the more general. I'm not getting personal about this. I'm just reminding you about a skill that might be a better choice for you to try right now instead of these intensive, impulsive behaviors that you might be engaging in. As we look at teaching those skills, we can go back to that triangle. And when you look at the universal interventions, again, if we can choose 3 or 4 of those skills that we all teach, then we're more proactive and we're setting our kids up for success, all of our kids. So when they come into our foreign country of school where they might not know we have totally different rules than maybe they have at home, now we can clearly communicate what those school expectations are and teach those intentionally and across the board so that everyone knows exactly what we mean about school skills. And that goes for all grades. We may think to ourselves that, well, I'm teaching middle school or high school. These kids should know how to do school. And my response to that is, these kids have been in school for 8 or 9 years, and that's exactly why they don't know how to do school. Because if you think about how many teachers they've had over those years and wonder, did each of those teachers have the same expectations? Probably not. And so that means that these kids, the longer they're in school, the more examples they've had of how different people operate in different ways and have different expectations in the classroom. And so if we don't intentionally teach them our expectations in our building or our school, we leave them to their own devices. They get to choose from that potpourri of teachers that they've had in the past and decide which one they like the most. And that's the behavior that they're going to exhibit. So we want to teach those skills consistently and intentionally at a universal level so that all kids can be successful. These would be trainings like the well-managed schools. We have safe and healthy secondary schools, as well as teaching social skills in schools, just to start that conversation of being intentional about teaching skills. This creates a predictable, safe environment where kids can be more successful not only academically, but also behaviorally. Those skills also help us to better define the other tiers in the triangle as well. So we look at a secondary or a tier 2 intervention. Now, if we identify that a student is continually having difficulty with maybe accepting decisions of authority or accepting a no answer, well, now we can be specific with that tier 2. We may do a check-in, check-out with that student as a tier 2 intervention. And when they check in with us in the morning, we're going to talk about accepting decisions of authority. We may talk about the specific class that they were struggling in or the specific teacher and say, if we just can remember how to accept decisions of authority or how to accept a no answer, if you just try it that way and then check back with me later in the day and tell me how it goes. We can be more specific with those tier 2 interventions, with that connection with an adult. We can also be more specific when we're looking at group work with kids. So you may be utilizing restorative practices. And so maybe in Circle, you might start with a couple of skills to tie to how we interact with one another in Circle. So for example, we might start with the skill of listening and the skill of having a conversation. So when we talk with kids, a lot of times when we ask them, what's more challenging or what's more difficult? Is it more difficult to listen to someone that has an opposing view or a different view? Or is it more challenging to have a conversation with someone that has a different view? And almost every time the kids respond that it's harder to listen. So that tells us that's a skill that we need to practice. In order to practice it, we have to teach it first. And so that might be what we start with in our restorative circle. So really being able to include these specific skills in all levels of the tiers, in all tiers. And then if you look at that top tier, we may identify that one target skill. The one skill that we want to focus on with that individual student to help them be more successful in a universal setting. And sometimes that's going to require some level of motivation or token economy. So we're going to have to look at what really motivates that child. Again, a lot of times that 5% behaviorally, those are the ones that we're applying zero tolerance policies to, and we're sending them home. And quite frankly, that's exactly where they want to be. So if we can switch that and really start looking at more proactive social emotional interventions and strategies consistently, we're able to keep those kids in school, and we're able to reduce that use of zero tolerance policies, and thereby starting to close that circle, starting to close that school to prison pipeline. Because if we don't teach these kids, even the most challenging ones, the behaviors necessary for them to be successful, that's where they're going to end up. They're never going to get those skills unless we teach them. So applying social skills across our curriculum, across our campus universally, in the same way that we teach academic skills, helps kids to be more successful. And it also helps us as adults to have better conversations, not only with one another when we're talking about a challenging student, but also when we're talking with parents. Because if we can't intentionally define our school expectations, then we'll constantly be at odds with home or with parents and their rules. Because, for example, if at home, when I get in an argument with my brothers, my mom says, "Don't you come tattle to me, you go work it out. You boys work it out, you take care of it." And so at home, I just take care of it, and that's what I'm supposed to do. But then at school, I come and I might have a disagreement with some of my peers out at recess, and I take care of it. And at school, that's not appropriate. But if we're not able to articulate what is appropriate at school, then we are going to be in we're going to have constant conflict with mom. Because if we disrespect mom or we disrespect mom's rules, we're never going to get the support that we need to shape more pro-social behaviors. So for example, if that's the case, if I just take care of it and then get in trouble at school, if I can have a conversation with the student and with mom about disagreeing appropriately, and here at school, we're going to disagree appropriately because this is the skill that's going to be necessary for this individual to be a lifelong learner. But at home, you can go ahead and keep taking care of it yourself. That's fine if that's the way that you want to do it at home. And I don't disrespect that, and I don't judge that. But here at school, so we all know what the expectations are, we're going to teach disagreeing appropriately. And we can tell mom exactly what that looks and sounds like. And we can also communicate that with the student. Because when we start to teach it, then we can practice it. We can reinforce it and praise it. And we can also correct around it. But what we find is when we're more proactive, we create that environment of safety. We create a climate of learning. We create a climate of calm. So we want to teach it first, and then we spend much less time correcting it. And we also start to really limit the use of those more severe punishments like zero tolerance, suspension, and expulsion. So let's review. As we look at the zero tolerance and the initial goals of zero tolerance, we can find after looking over the last couple of decades that we're not getting the outcomes that were intended with zero tolerance policies. So if we want to address that and start keeping kids in school and closing that school to prison pipeline, we want to intentionally develop interventions and strategies that promote safety, physical health, and mental health. And again, this starts with multi-tiered systems or positive interventions. When we start to intentionally teach those things and start to put that structure in place, that allows us to build relationships with kids. Helps us not to become so personal in our punishment and consequences. Helps us to have conversations, which teach those life skills, those social skills that they need to be successful. This proactive approach really helps to reduce our stress levels as educators as well. It feels much better to be proactive and positive using teaching and praise instead of being so dependent on consequences. When we know how we're going to respond to behavior, it provides that sense of confidence for us to be successful as educators, not only in our academics, but in managing behaviors. This also provides structure for our classroom management, and we know that that requires training. As we look at studies and research out there, it's pointing more and more to having some sort of consistent classroom management training, such as what Boys Town provides. This then helps us to have those school-wide positive behavior supports that are clearly articulated. So again, moving from that philosophical idea to something practical and concrete. This then also allows us to have some of those alternatives for suspension. So looking at that behavior, providing the supports necessary for them to be successful. And this helps us to limit those out-of-school suspensions for those most egregious behaviors and be able to address the majority of behaviors right inside our schools. So if you're looking for options to address zero tolerance and the increased suspensions and expulsions, I point you back to the multi-tiered triangle. First, looking at and assessing what do you have in place as a universal intervention. Is it clearly communicated? Have you clearly identified those things so that all adults in the building know what those expectations are and can define them clearly and consistently? And then what do you have in place for the secondary, for those 15% that might need a little bit of help? And do those truly connect? Are you using the same language between your universal intervention and your tier 2 or tier 3? How are those connecting? And I think that looking at social skills is going to help you to better define that. We offer a wide range of resources. In addition to the trainings that we offer at Boys Town, we also have a lot of resources in our Boys Town Press catalog. And I encourage you to take a look, even to just begin thinking about implementing some of these skill-based approaches. Teaching social skills to youth, we have 182 social skills clearly defined, so you can just go to town looking at those skills and picking a few to start using with your students in your classroom or in your school. The Well-Managed Schools is a nice resource. It might be something that you consider as a book study with your staff or even with some PLCs to start looking at defining your strategies for a school-wide approach to addressing behavior and building those social emotional competencies with students. We also have the positive alternatives to suspension. There's a webinar introducing you to positive alternatives to suspension and some of the specific strategies that we recommend for using in those alternative settings. We also offer specialized classroom management, which is the most intensive training that we provide, and this would be for your highest level, that tier 3, and it goes into a token economy and motivation system, how to identify skill deficits, those specific skills with kids, and how to shape those intentionally and proactively so that they can be more successful in a universal setting. You can also download the resource checklist just to take a look at your readiness for change and looking at where your campus or district is in the process of change, in shifting from traditional approaches to more proactive approaches for zero tolerance and behavior strategies. So again, thank you for taking time today to talk with me about zero tolerance policies. I hope that you are walking away with a better understanding of the history of zero tolerance, the impact that it's had on our schools, our students, and our communities, as well as some practical strategies that you can take back and try for yourself.